On a quiet spring night in May of 1983, a story was told that would soon unravel under the weight of its own contradictions. It was the kind of story that initially sounded tragic, random, and cruel. A mother, three children, a lonely road, a stranger who vanished into the darkness. But as investigators would learn, some of the most terrifying crimes do not begin with strangers at all. They begin at home. Diane Downs was living in Oregon at the time, a woman in her late 20s who presented herself as energetic, confident, and unusually cheerful. To many people around her, she appeared carefree, even charming. She enjoyed attention, spoke easily, and often described herself as someone who simply wanted happiness. But beneath that outward image, relationships around her were strained, unstable, and often marked by manipulation. Diane was the mother of three children. Cheryl, the oldest, was 7 years old. Christy was 8. Danny, the youngest, was 3. Friends and coworkers would later describe Diane as emotionally distant from her children, sometimes referring to them as burdens rather than responsibilities. While she could appear affectionate in public, those closest to her noticed an inconsistency in her parenting, one that shifted depending on who was watching. In the months leading up to the crime, Diane became involved with a married man. The relationship was intense, obsessive, and one-sided. He made it clear that he did not want children in his life. To Diane, this rejection became a fixation. People close to her later recalled her expressing frustration, resentment, and despair over the idea that her children stood between her and the life she believed she deserved. On the night of May 19, 1983, Diane claimed she was driving her children home after an evening outing. According to her account, while traveling on a quiet rural road near Springfield, Oregon, she was flagged down by a man she described as a stranger. She said he attempted to carjack her, pulled out a gun, and fired into the vehicle before fleeing into the darkness. Shortly after, Diane drove to a nearby hospital. Emergency staff were met with a horrifying scene. One child was unresponsive. 2 others were critically injured. Diane herself had a wound that appeared minor in comparison. As medical personnel worked desperately to save the children, law enforcement began the process of documenting Diane's story. From the very beginning, something did not sit right. Witnesses at the hospital noted Diane's demeanor. While parents in similar situations often appeared frantic, distraught, or inconsolable, Diane's behavior was strikingly different. She was calm. She spoke clearly. At times, she even appeared upbeat. Some staff later recalled her smiling, chatting casually, and showing an emotional detachment that felt deeply unsettling given the circumstances. Police officers listening to her account began to notice inconsistencies. Her description of the alleged attacker was vague and changed subtly with each retelling. The location of the shooting did not match the physical evidence found in the vehicle. The trajectory of the bullets raised serious questions. And perhaps most troubling of all, there were no signs of a struggle consistent with a sudden roadside ambush. As investigators examined the scene and the car, the story of a random stranger began to collapse. Ballistic evidence suggested the shots were fired from close range, not from outside the vehicle as Diane had claimed. The weapon used was similar to one Diane had previously owned. No witnesses came forward to support the existence of the mysterious gunman. No physical evidence placed anyone else at the scene. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, the surviving children were fighting for their lives. Cheryl, the oldest, did not survive. Her death would later become the central charge in the case. Christy and Danny, despite their injuries, lived. At the time, Christy was unable to speak, leaving investigators without the most important voice of all, but doctors remained hopeful. As police continued their work, they began looking deeper into Diane Downs' life. What they uncovered painted a troubling psychological portrait. They learned about her unstable relationships, her desire to start over, and her growing resentment toward motherhood. Friends and coworkers described moments where Diane spoke about her children as obstacles rather than individuals she loved. One coworker later recalled Diane expressing envy toward people without children. Another remembered her saying that life would be easier if she could simply be free. These statements, once dismissed as casual complaints, now took on a far darker meaning. When Christie eventually regained the ability to speak, the case shifted dramatically. In a quiet hospital room with medical staff present, she answered a simple question about what had happened that night. Her response was not complicated. It did not change. It did not waver. She said her mother shot them. Those words cut through every remaining doubt. Investigators now had confirmation that matched the physical evidence they had been collecting since the beginning. The narrative of a random attack was no longer just unlikely. It was impossible. Diane Downs was arrested and charged. As the legal process began, the public became transfixed by the case. Media coverage intensified not because of the crime alone, but because of the person accused of committing it. A mother, calm, smiling, unapologetic, insisting on her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. For viewers of dark Psyche Case Files, this case forces an uncomfortable question. How does someone reach a point where self-interest overrides the most basic human bond? And how often do warning signs go unnoticed until it is too late? As this case moves toward trial, the psychological unraveling of Diane Downs would become just as important as the physical evidence. What the jury would soon hear would challenge everything society believes about motherhood, empathy, and evil. If you're finding this breakdown insightful, this is a good moment to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this case and others like it, only on Dark Psyche Case Files. As Diane Downs sat in custody awaiting trial, investigators and prosecutors began the meticulous task of reconstructing not only the events of that night, but the woman at the center of them. This was no longer just a question of what happened on a dark rural road in Oregon. It had become a question of who Diane Downs truly was, and whether the image she projected masked something far more disturbing. From the outside, Diane appeared cooperative. She spoke freely with police, repeated her version of events, and maintained that she was the victim of a senseless act of violence. But as interviews continued, her storytelling grew increasingly strained. Details shifted, timelines blurred. Certain emotional responses felt rehearsed rather than genuine. To seasoned investigators, it was the kind of behavior that suggested performance, not trauma. Prosecutors began to assemble a comprehensive psychological and behavioral profile. They interviewed coworkers, former friends, neighbors, and past romantic partners. A consistent pattern emerged. Diane craved admiration. She wanted to be desired, envied, and seen as special. When attention faded, she often created situations that redirected focus back to herself. Several people recalled her exaggerating stories about her life. Others remembered moments where she seemed emotionally disconnected from the suffering of those around her. There were accounts of Diane laughing at inappropriate times, particularly when discussing serious matters. At first, these stories seemed merely odd. In the context of the crime, they became deeply troubling. The relationship with the married man took center stage during the investigation. Prosecutors learned that Diane had been obsessively attached to him. She believed that if she could remove the obstacles in her life, she could finally have the future she wanted. Witnesses would later testify that Diane had spoken openly about how difficult her children made her life. She complained about the responsibility. She complained about the limitations. And most alarmingly, she complained about how they interfered with her romantic desires. In court, these statements would not be framed as idle frustration. They would be presented as motive. Meanwhile, Christie continued her recovery. Doctors described her as resilient but emotionally guarded. When questioned gently and carefully, her account remained consistent. She did not embellish. She did not hesitate. She identified her mother as the person who had harmed them. For the prosecution, Christie's testimony would become the emotional backbone of the case. For the defense, it was the most dangerous threat they faced. Diane's legal team attempted to discredit Christie's account before the trial even began. They suggested confusion, trauma, coaching, anything that could cast doubt on a child's words, but medical professionals and psychologists countered these claims. They stated that Christie's injuries were severe, but her memory was intact. Her statements were spontaneous, not rehearsed, and she showed no signs of being influenced by investigators or family members. As the trial approached, public interest exploded. Media outlets covered Diane Downs obsessively. Cameras followed her movements. Reporters analyzed her facial expressions, her posture, her smiles. The public was divided, not over the evidence, but over how someone accused of such a crime could appear so emotionally unaffected. During pretrial hearings, Diane's behavior continued to draw attention. She smiled frequently. She laughed softly at inappropriate moments. She spoke about herself often, rarely mentioning her children unless prompted. When she did speak about them, her words lacked warmth. Observers noted that she referred to them almost as concepts rather than people. Psychological experts would later describe her behavior as consistent with narcissistic traits, an inability to feel empathy, a need for admiration, a belief that rules did not apply to her. While no diagnosis was required for conviction, the pattern supported the prosecution's narrative. This was not an act of panic. It was an act of calculation. As jury selection began, prosecutors faced a delicate task. They needed to present the truth without alienating jurors. They avoided graphic descriptions. They focused on evidence, timelines, and testimony. The goal was clarity, not shock. The case was already disturbing enough. Behind the scenes, Diane continued to insist on her innocence. She granted interviews. She spoke to journalists. She portrayed herself as misunderstood, unlucky, and unfairly targeted. Each appearance only deepened public suspicion. The disconnect between her words and the reality of the evidence became impossible to ignore. For Dark Psyche Case Files, this phase of the case reveals something critical. Crimes like this are rarely impulsive. They are built over time, shaped by unchecked entitlement, emotional detachment, and a willingness to sacrifice others for personal desire. Diane Downs did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as deserving. As the courtroom doors prepared to open and the trial loomed closer, one truth became unavoidable. This case would not hinge on mystery. It would hinge on belief. Would the jury believe the smiling mother who claimed she was a victim of chance, or the quiet child whose words carried the weight of survival? If this chapter added clarity to the psychological depth of this case, remember to like the video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button to stay with Dark Psyche Case Files as we continue uncovering the truth behind some of the most unsettling cases in criminal history. The trial of Diane Downs began in the fall of 1984, and from the first day, it was clear that this case would test the emotional limits of everyone involved. The courtroom was packed with reporters, observers, and members of the public who had followed the story closely. What unfolded was not just a legal battle, but a psychological one, where perception, credibility, and behavior mattered just as much as evidence. Diane entered the courtroom with a confidence that immediately drew attention. She smiled often, made eye contact with spectators, and appeared relaxed. To some, she looked like a woman unfairly accused. To others, her demeanor felt disturbingly out of place. While the families of victims often appear weighed down by grief, Diane appeared energized by the attention. The prosecution began by carefully laying out the timeline of the night in question. They walked the jury through Diane's account, then methodically contrasted it with the physical evidence. The location of the wounds, the trajectory of the bullets, the absence of any proof supporting the existence of a stranger. Each detail chipped away at the story Diane had repeated since the night of the shootings. Medical experts testified next. They explained the nature of the children's injuries in clinical, non-graphic terms, focusing only on what was necessary for understanding. They emphasized that the injuries could not have occurred in the way Diane described. The evidence suggested proximity, control, and intent. This was not chaos. It was deliberate. When Christie took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She was still young, still recovering, and still visibly affected by what she had endured. Prosecutors asked questions gently, allowing her to speak in her own words. Her testimony was brief, calm, and consistent. She did not dramatize. She did not hesitate. She stated plainly that her mother had shot them. For many in the courtroom, this was the most powerful moment of the trial, not because of emotion, but because of clarity. Christie's account aligned with the forensic evidence, the timelines, and the investigative findings. There were no contradictions, no confusion, just a quiet statement of truth. The defense attempted to undermine her credibility. They suggested that trauma could distort memory. They questioned whether she might have been influenced by others. But expert witnesses countered these claims, explaining that Christie's recollection showed none of the signs typically associated with false memory or suggestion. Her consistency over time only strengthened her reliability. As the trial progressed, attention increasingly shifted back to Diane herself. Her reactions during testimony were closely watched. When evidence was presented about her children, she showed little visible emotion. When her own actions were discussed, she leaned forward, attentive, sometimes even smiling. Jurors could not ignore the contrast. The prosecution introduced testimony from people who knew Diane personally. Coworkers spoke about her frequent complaints about motherhood. Friends described her fixation on her romantic relationship and her frustration with the responsibilities of having children. These statements were not presented as character attacks, but as context. They helped the jury understand motive. Perhaps most damaging were Diane's own words. Recorded interviews and past statements were played in court, revealing contradictions and moments where her version of events changed. Each inconsistency further weakened her credibility. The image she tried to maintain began to fracture under scrutiny. Throughout the trial, Diane insisted on testifying in her own defense. When she took the stand, she spoke confidently, recounting her story once again. But under cross-examination, prosecutors exposed gaps in her narrative. Simple questions revealed answers that did not align with evidence already established. Her certainty began to waver. Observers noted that Diane appeared more concerned with how she was perceived than with the fate of her children. She spoke about herself frequently, emphasizing her struggles and her pain. Rarely did she express concern for the lasting impact on her surviving children. This absence did not go unnoticed by the jury. As closing arguments approached, the case had become less about doubt and more about inevitability. The prosecution reminded jurors that this was not a story built on speculation. It was built on evidence, testimony, and truth spoken by those who survived. The defense, struggling to regain ground, leaned heavily on the idea of uncertainty. But uncertainty was in short supply. For Dark Psyche Case Files, this chapter highlights a critical truth. Sometimes, the most telling evidence is not hidden in complexity, but revealed in plain sight. In Diane Downs' case, it was not only what she said, but how she said it, and what she never said at all. If this chapter helped you understand how courtroom behavior and psychology can influence justice, remember to like the video, leave a comment with your perspective, and hit the subscribe button to stay connected with Dark Psyche Case Files. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the focus shifted from what had happened to what it all meant. The jury was no longer being asked to simply evaluate evidence. They were being asked to understand intent, responsibility, and the psychological reality behind the crime. This was the phase where the true weight of the case settled into the courtroom. The prosecution used this stage to reinforce a central theme. This was not an act of panic. It was not the result of confusion or fear. It was a calculated decision driven by self-interest. They reminded the jury that Diane Downs had multiple opportunities to seek help, to choose differently, and to protect her children. Instead, every step she took moved her closer to tragedy. Expert witnesses in psychology were called to explain behavior patterns, not to diagnose, but to provide context. They spoke about individuals who prioritize personal desire above all else, even when it causes harm. They described how such individuals can appear charming, composed, and convincing, especially in public settings. These explanations offered jurors a framework to understand Diane's unusual demeanor without sensationalism. The defense attempted to counter this narrative by portraying Diane as misunderstood. They argued that her behavior was the result of stress, exhaustion, and emotional overwhelm. They suggested that the public and media had unfairly judged her based on how they believed a grieving mother should act, but this argument struggled to gain traction. What undermined the defense most was consistency. The prosecution's case did not rely on a single witness or a single piece of evidence. It was a network of facts that supported one another. Physical evidence aligned with testimony. Testimony aligned with behavioral history. And behavioral history aligned with motive. Removing one element did not collapse the case. It reinforced it. When closing arguments were delivered, the tone in the courtroom changed. Prosecutors spoke calmly, deliberately, and without dramatics. They reminded the jury that this case was not about emotion, but about accountability. They emphasized that the law does not measure guilt by appearances, but by actions and evidence. They asked the jury to remember the quiet strength of Christie's testimony, to remember the silence where excuses failed, to remember that truth does not need embellishment to be powerful. The story of that night had been told many times, but only one version matched reality. The defense's closing argument focused heavily on doubt. They urged jurors to question every assumption, every interpretation. They warned against rushing to judgment. But doubt requires uncertainty, and by this point, uncertainty was scarce. Even without emotional appeals, the evidence spoke clearly. After deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Diane Downs was found guilty of the murder of her daughter Cheryl and the attempted murder of her two surviving children. The courtroom reacted not with shock, but with a sense of grim confirmation. The outcome felt inevitable. During sentencing, Diane remained composed. She showed little visible reaction as the court handed down a sentence of life in prison plus additional years. There were no dramatic outbursts, no visible remorse, just quiet acceptance as if the moment were another chapter in a story centered on herself. For many observers, this was the most unsettling aspect of the case. Not the crime alone, but the absence of regret, the lack of acknowledgement, the inability or unwillingness to recognize the harm inflicted on her own children. For Dark Psyche Case Files, this chapter represents the moment where justice confronts psychology, where the legal system steps in to impose boundaries that personal conscience failed to respect. It is a reminder that accountability exists not to punish emotion, but to protect life. If this chapter helped deepen your understanding of how justice unfolds in complex cases like this, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button to stay connected with Dark Psyche Case Files. Long after the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, the Diane Downs case refused to fade quietly into history. Unlike many convictions that settle into obscurity, this one continued to ripple outward, raising questions not only about crime, but about identity, deception, and the way society understands evil when it wears a familiar face. Diane Downs was transferred into the state prison system, where she quickly became known for the same traits that had defined her during the investigation and trial. She remained articulate, outwardly confident, and convinced of her own narrative. To correctional staff and mental health professionals, she did not present as broken or remorseful. Instead, she presented as misunderstood. She continued to insist that she was innocent, claiming she had been framed by circumstance and betrayed by those who should have believed her. In interviews conducted from prison, she often spoke about her own suffering, her loneliness, and the unfairness of her sentence. What was noticeably absent, time and again, was genuine reflection on the harm done to her children. This pattern reinforced what psychologists had observed throughout the case. Diane Downs did not experience events as shared human tragedies. She experienced them as personal inconveniences or attacks on her self-image. Her inner world revolved around how she was perceived, not how others were affected. Several years into her sentence, Diane managed to escape from custody. The escape was brief, lasting only a few days, but it reignited national attention. For many, it confirmed what they had long suspected. Diane did not accept boundaries, not legal ones, not moral ones, not even the physical walls of a prison. She was recaptured without incident and returned to custody, where she faced additional consequences. Yet even this moment did not appear to change her self-perception. To Diane, the escape was not a mistake. It was an attempt to reclaim a life she believed had been stolen from her. Over time, another unsettling development emerged. Diane became pregnant while incarcerated and later gave birth. The child was placed for adoption, removed from her care. This event reopened painful debates in the public sphere. Should someone convicted of such crimes be allowed to have more children? Can biology be separated from behavior? And how does society protect the innocent when warning signs are already written in history? For Christy and Danny, the surviving children, life continued far away from cameras and courtrooms. They were raised under new guardianship, given new identities, and protected from public exposure as much as possible. Their stories became private, not because they lacked importance, but because healing required distance from the case that defined their early lives. What remains publicly known is this: Christie's testimony changed the course of the case. Her courage, quiet and unwavering, became a symbol of truth breaking through manipulation. She did not seek attention. She did not seek recognition. She simply told the truth when it mattered most. As the years passed, Diane became a case study in criminal psychology textbooks. Analysts pointed to her behavior as an example of extreme self-centeredness, emotional detachment, and the dangerous potential of unchecked entitlement. Her case is often referenced not because it is unique, but because it is disturbingly plausible. This is what makes the Diane Downs case so unsettling. There was no shadowy criminal network, no mysterious accomplice, no chaotic spree. The threat came from within the family unit itself, hidden behind smiles, routines, and normalcy. It was a reminder that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it blends in. For dark Psyche Case Files, this case serves as a warning and a lesson. Evil is not always loud. It is not always angry. Sometimes it is calm, convincing, and deeply self-assured. And when society struggles to recognize it, the consequences can be irreversible. As parole hearings came and went, Diane was repeatedly denied release. Each denial cited the same concerns: lack of remorse, failure to accept responsibility, continued risk. The system, designed to assess change, found none that could be trusted. Today, Diane Downs remains incarcerated, her story frozen in time, while the lives she damaged moved forward without her. The case endures not because of spectacle, but because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior, parental identity, and the limits of empathy. With time, the Diane Downs case shifted from breaking news to cultural reference, yet its psychological weight never lessened. Unlike cases that rely on mystery or unresolved questions, this one remained disturbingly clear. The facts were settled. The verdict was final. What lingered was the discomfort of understanding how easily destruction can exist behind familiarity. Inside prison, Diane continued to draw attention. She wrote letters, sought interviews, and cultivated relationships that often followed the same pattern seen throughout her life. initial charm, emotional intensity, eventual manipulation. To those unfamiliar with her history, she could appear thoughtful, even reflective. But to those who knew the case well, her words rarely moved beyond self-justification. Parole boards repeatedly reviewed her case, as procedure required. Each time, the conclusion was the same. Diane did not acknowledge responsibility in any meaningful way. She framed herself as a victim of misunderstanding rather than the architect of irreversible harm. Without accountability, there could be no confidence in rehabilitation. Parole was denied again and again. The legal system had done its part, but the emotional aftermath extended far beyond court rulings. The case became a reference point in discussions about parental violence, narcissistic personality traits, and the limits of empathy. It was studied not because it was sensational, but because it challenged assumptions. Society often believes that love is automatic within families. This case proved that assumption can be dangerous. For Christy and Danny, survival meant separation from the narrative that once defined them. Their lives moved forward quietly, deliberately shielded from public scrutiny. This distance was an act of protection, not secrecy. Healing required the freedom to exist beyond headlines and courtroom transcripts. What endured publicly was Christie's role in bringing truth to light. Her testimony was never dramatic. It was never loud. It did not need to be. In a case clouded by manipulation, her words cut through with simplicity and honesty. She reminded the world that truth does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives softly and still changes everything. The Diane Downs case also left a lasting impact on how investigators approach crimes involving caregivers. It reinforced the need to follow evidence rather than assumptions. It demonstrated that emotional presentation can mislead. Calm does not equal innocence. Confidence does not equal truth. And familiarity does not equal safety. Over the years, public interest would resurface whenever Diane's name appeared in connection with appeals or parole hearings. Each time, the reaction was the same, a collective reminder of what happened and why it mattered, not out of fascination but out of vigilance. This case is remembered not because of how it ended, but because of what it revealed. It showed how self-interest, when left unchecked, can override even the most fundamental human bonds. It exposed how manipulation can masquerade as normalcy. And it proved that sometimes, the most dangerous people are those who believe they deserve more than others, at any cost. For Dark Psyche Case Files, this story stands as one of the clearest examples of psychological darkness hidden behind an ordinary life. It is not told to shock, but to understand. Not to sensationalize, but to recognize warning signs that often go unnoticed. As this case file closes, the truth remains unchanged. Justice was served. Survivors endured. And a story that began with a lie ended with accountability. If you stayed with us through this entire case, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future deep dive case files exploring the darkest corners of the human mind, only on Dark Psyche Case Files.